Beatrice Alden, the vicar's daughter, patched the same grey glove for the third winter running. The new land agent tipped his hat to her on the vestry step. She did not once look up. Thread through the eye, knot pulled tight, needle set down. A man who tips his hat wants nothing from a woman who mends her own gloves. She had learned that at 16. She was 26 now, and she had stopped hoping otherwise. But here is what she did not know. The man tipping that hat was the Duke of Kelmscar, Adrian Voss. Weary to the marrow after his third London season of heiresses, who priced him like plate on a sideboard. He had come home to his neglected Shropshire acres, and he had done a mad thing. He had turned to his old steward in the empty great house that 40 servants kept for a master none of them could please, and he had said, "I'll court her as Thomas Ainsley. 40 shillings a month, and no name worth marrying. And if she loves that man, that plain man in a stable coat, then I'll finally know." The steward thought it folly. He was right. And he was wrong, because 90 days from that tipped hat, the whole village would gather in the great hall for the harvest assembly. And on that one night, the plain silver ring, hidden in a clerk's coat pocket, would meet the coronet ring locked in the Duke's own study. One of them would be given. One of them would be refused. And I will not tell you yet which comes first. If you have ever longed to be loved for the person you are, and not for anything you carry, not your purse, not your name, not one thing you could set down and lose, then sit with me. This story is for you. Before we go on, if a plain silver ring means something to you, subscribe and stay to the end, because the ending turns on a single word she says at the exact middle of this tale. And do this for me, comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far a plain silver ring can travel. Wherever you are tonight, we begin in one small place. Fenwick Cross, in Shropshire, in the autumn of the year 1874. It was a poor parish, but it was hers. The reading school met in the vestry because the vestry was free and the schoolhouse had a hole in its floor no one could pay to mend. Beatrice ran it herself. 12 ploughboys and 3 dairymaids ranged along 2 benches, their breath fogging in the cold stone room. She taught them their letters by candle end and by rushlight, and when the candle ends ran short, she taught them by the grey window light and the sound of her own steady voice. She kept her father's accounts too. She translated Latin deeds for the solicitor in Ludlow and Greek passages for a gentleman in Shrewsbury who paid her by the page and never once guessed the scholar he paid was a woman. Pennies, it all came down to pennies, in that house. But the pennies kept the school benches under the boys, and the boys learned, and Beatrice told herself that was enough of a life for anyone. The gentry did not see her. That was simply a fact, like the cold in the stone. She would pass Lady Cassandra Vaunt on the Ludlow Road and receive nothing. Not a nod, not a flick of the eye. A debtor's daughter, a bluestocking, a woman who mended her own gloves. There was nothing in Beatrice Alden to catch a fine lady's notice, and Beatrice had made her peace with that, or told herself she had, which is not always the same thing. She had one vanity. Only one. She noticed hands. She could not help it. A man's face could lie, most of them did, but his hands told the truth of him. A reader's hands, soft at the fingertip from turning pages. A labourer's hands, split and blunt and honest. Her father's hands, ink at the knuckle, trembling now in the mornings in a way she pretended not to see. She read hands the way other women read faces, and she trusted what she read. Which is why, when Thomas Ainsley came to the vestry the following week to arrange the estate's tithe, the first thing she truly noticed about him was that his hands were wrong. He came in out of the rain and stood by the door and did not interrupt. She was at the head of the room with a slate, drilling the Latin of the tithe itself, for the boys should know what the words on the paper meant that took the 10th of their father's corn. She had written a line on the slate. A boy read it back and stumbled, and she was about to correct him when the man by the door said, quietly, "Forgive me." The verb wants the subjunctive there. He was right. She turned and looked at him properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd thought from the door, 34 perhaps. Rain in his dark hair. A plain brown coat, decent but not new, the coat of a man on 40 shillings a month, and he had corrected her Latin, corrected her, in her own vestry, as easily as breathing. "You have your grammar, Mr. Ainsley," she said. "A little. Beaten into me young." He smiled, and it was a good smile, rueful at the edge. "You have more." That was the ablative absolute you set them, and not one of these lads flinched. That's teaching. She should have sent him off with the tithe papers and thought no more of him. Instead, she found herself arguing with him. Not the tithe, the Greek. She'd set the older boys a line of Xenophon, and he had views on it, wrong ones, and she told him so, and he defended his ground and lost it, laughing, and the boys watched this strange grown-up quarrel with round eyes. It went on longer than it had any business to. When at last he gathered the tithe papers to go, the rain had stopped, and she realized she had not once. In half an hour, remembered the state of her gloves. At the door he paused. She saw him fold his right hand half-closed, as though hiding it. She had already seen. On the smallest finger next his ring finger, no, on the ring finger itself, a band of skin paler than the rest, where a ring had sat for years and sat no longer. He saw her see it. Men always thought she didn't notice things. This one, at least, did her the courtesy of an answer. "A signet," he said. "My father's. I pawned it in a bad year and never bought it back." A small shrug. One learns to do without. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. A man who has pawned his father's ring is a man who has known a fall. She knew about falls. Don't be. It was only gold. He put his hat on. "Good day, Miss Alden. Mind the subjunctive." And he was gone into the wet lane, and she stood there with the slate in her hand and told herself firmly that a woman of 26 had no business feeling anything at all about a land agent's smile. "You saw it, though, that pale band on his finger. File it away." She believed his answer. "You will not." He came back. Of course he came back. There was a hole in the vestry roof directly above the reading benches, and the estate owned the vestry, and it was the land agent's proper business to see it mended, or so he said, arriving on a dry Tuesday with a borrowed ladder and a bundle of new laths under his arm. "You needn't do this yourself," Beatrice told him, following him out to where the ladder leaned. "The estate keeps men for it. The estate keeps men who are busy with the harvest and a roof that leaks on children now, not in December." He set his foot on the bottom rung. "Hand me up those laths as I call for them, if you'd be so good, and we may as well finish the Xenophon while we're about it." "I've thought of an argument." So she stood at the foot of the ladder and handed up laths, and they finished the Xenophon, shouting Greek at one another across the rungs, and it was, she could not afterward think of another word for it, it was happy. She had not been happy in a long while. She'd been useful and dutiful and tired. This was different. This was a thing that cost nothing and fed something in her she'd thought long starved. But she watched his hands on the laths. That was the trouble. She watched, because she always watched, and his hands were wrong again, worse than wrong, this time, because she saw them clearly in the sun. They were sure. They set the laths true and drove the nails clean. But they were soft where a labourer's would be horned and split. And they were unmarked where a clerk's would be ink stained at the side of the middle finger, the way her own were, the way every writing man's were. These were not a clerk's hands. They were not a workman's hands. They were the hands of a man who had never in his life had to earn his bread with them, and had lately, for some reason, chosen to. "You handle a hammer well," she said, "for a land agent, not a flicker." But a small stillness, half a second, before he answered. "My father held that a gentleman's son should know how a house is built." He was a hard man about it. He drove the last nail. There, no more rain on your scholars. She let it go. But she carried the little stillness home with her and turned it over by the fire that night, the way she turned over a difficult line of Greek. A hard father, a pawned ring. Hands that had never worked and now did. A ruined gentleman, she thought. A gentleman's son fallen on evil days, come down in the world to a land agent's 40 shillings, and too proud to say so plainly. And God forgive her, it made her like him more. Because she knew that fall, she was falling herself, only slower. She did not yet know how far, or how soon, but the man who told her would arrive within the week, on a good horse, in a good coat, with a paper in his saddlebag that would put a number on her family's ruin. His name was Silas Croom, and he came from the Harndean and Croom Bank. He came first to her father. Beatrice was in the vestry with the boys when she heard the good horse in the lane, and by the time she reached the vicarage the study door was shut, and it stayed shut a long while. When it opened, the man who came out had a soft banker's face and a hard banker's eye, and he looked at Beatrice on the stair as a butcher looks at a beast, not unkindly, only measuring the weight of her. "Your servant, Miss Alden," he said, and put on his hat, and rode away. Her father would not tell her all of it. That was the beginning of the real trouble, though she didn't know it, not the debt itself, but her father's pride, that would not let her see the whole of it while there was still time to fight. What she dragged from him, over the cold supper, was this. Years ago, before the mill closed, when the village still had hope, the woolen mill at Fenwick Cross had wanted capital, and the men of standing in the parish had put their names to a bond to raise it. Her father among them. A clergyman's name given to help his people. The mill had failed, the other names had slipped away, died, gone bankrupt, gone abroad, and the bond had come to rest entire on the one name left standing. "How much?" Beatrice said. Her father looked at his hands. "It is being managed." "Papa, how much?" "It is being managed, Beatrice," and he would say no more, and she saw that saying more would break something in him, so she stopped. She should not have stopped, she would come to know that. But she loved him, and love is not always wise. What he would not tell her, she learned in pieces over the following days, from the solicitor's clerk in Ludlow, who owed her a kindness. £620, a sum past all imagining in that house, where the year turned on pennies. And a clause, 90 days from the calling of the note, and not 1 day more. Pay, or the bank took the glebe acres, the parish's own land, that fed the living, and foreclosed the mortgage on the vicarage itself. The vicarage, which held the vestry, which held the school. Beatrice sat very still in the solicitor's outer room when the clerk told her the figure, and she did not weep, because weeping was a thing she had trained herself out of years ago as an expense she could not afford. But she felt the cold come up through the floor and into her, and she understood that 90 days from now, if nothing changed, there would be no benches, no boys, no letters drilled by rushlight, there would be nothing of her at all, and there was nothing she could do about it. £620. She might translate Greek until her eyes failed and never see the 10th part of it. Silas Croom wanted the glebe acres. That was the truth under the truth. Good land, cheap, if he could only foreclose it out of a bankrupt clergyman's hands. And a clergyman with a bluestocking daughter and no friends in the county was the softest quarry he'd found in years. He did not trouble to hide his satisfaction. Why should he? Who was there to stop him? Certainly not the land agent over the stable at the great house, a 40-shilling clerk. Beneath a bankman's notice entirely. The Kelmscar gathering came at the end of that same fortnight, and Beatrice almost did not go. It was held in the great hall of the estate, the Duke's Hall, though the Duke was abroad, everyone said, and the county made free with his house in his absence. It was custom for the parish to be asked, in a thin way the vicar and his daughter received once a year, among their betters, so that their betters might feel the warmth of their own condescension. Beatrice knew exactly what the invitation was worth, but her father wished to go, pride again, the wish to be seen upright while he still could be, and so she brushed her one good gown and mended the grey gloves a fourth time and went. The hall was beautiful, she would give it that. Candlelight the length of it, on old panelling and older silver, on the bright silk of the county ladies, on Lady Cassandra Vaunt at the centre of it all like a jewel in a case. Beatrice stood near the wall with her father and was not spoken to, and had expected as much, and bore it. Then Lady Cassandra saw her. It was not an accident. Beatrice understood that at once. The fine lady's eye found her by the wall, and something in it sharpened, and she said, not loudly, but pitched to carry, the way such things are always pitched to carry. Why, is that the little schoolmistress? The vicar's girl? How brave of her to come among us, all things considered. A stir. Faces turning, and Silas Croom, standing near, oiled and smiling, supplied the rest for those who hadn't heard. Considering the state of the living, you mean, he said. A hard business. The bond's called, you know. 90 days, and I fear the vicarage goes to the bank, school and all. He shook his head with false sorrow. One does grieve for the deserving poor, but a debt is a debt. Hardly marriage market goods, a debtor's daughter, though I'm sure she has her Greek. The laughter that followed was soft, and worse for being soft. Beatrice stood in the candlelight with every eye in that hall upon her, and she did the one thing that was left to her. She did not cry. She lifted her chin, and she looked back at them, at Cassandra, at Croom, at all the bright cruel faces, steady as the stone of her own vestry. If they wished to look at a debtor's daughter, then let them look at one who would not flinch. Her father had gone grey beside her. She took his arm to hold him up, and to hold herself up, and she waited it out. Across the hall, half in shadow by the servants' door, a man in a plain brown coat watched the whole of it. Thomas Ainsley. The land agent. No one marked him. Why would they mark the agent at his master's feast? He stood with his hands closed at his sides, and his knuckles were white, and no one saw that either. He watched his own guests, in his own hall, spit upon the woman he had come home to love. He watched her refuse to weep. And he could not move. Because to cross that floor and take her part, to name Croom a scoundrel and Cassandra a spiteful fool, as a duke may, was to end, in a single breath, the very test that was teaching him the only truth he had ever wanted. Was she loving the man, or the coronet? He was 3 feet from the answer. He was learning it right now, in the set of her jaw. To save her this pain would be to lose it. So he held still, and hated himself, and swore, silently, uselessly, there against the panelling, that whatever it cost, he would make this right. He did not yet know how. He did not yet know he'd get it wrong first, and nearly lose her by his own cleverness. But the vow was made in that hall, in the candlelight, 3 feet from a woman who did not know he was there. She did not know. Remember that. She left the hall on her father's arm, believing herself entirely alone, and the one man in England who could have lifted the whole weight from her in a sentence let her walk out into the cold rather than speak, because he loved her too well, and too foolishly, to stop the test that would prove she loved him back. They walked together after that, she and the clerk. It began by accident and became a habit, the lane by the glebe hedge in the late afternoons, when the school let out and his work eased. He would be at the stile as if by chance, and she would be at the stile as if by chance, and neither of them named the arrangement, because to name it would be to have to say what it was, and what it was had no future in it. A land agent on 40 shillings. a vicar's daughter with £620 of ruin round her neck. There was nothing there to build on. So they did not build. They only walked and talked, and each afternoon she went home warmer than she had any right to be. And each afternoon she gathered another thread. There was the day a farmer's boy met them in the lane, young Tom Pike, from the Low Farm, and the boy, seeing Ainsley, ducked his head and bent his knee in a bob that was very nearly a bow. A field boy does not bow to a land agent. He touches his cap. This was a bow, the deep reflexive bow a servant gives the master's blood, and the moment it was done the boy went scarlet and bolted. And Ainsley called something easy after him about the cattle in the low meadow, too quick and too smooth, covering it. Beatrice half saw. She filed it with the hands and the pale finger. There was the day the wool merchant's gig overtook them, and the merchant, a travelled man, a man who'd sold to Lyons and Antwerp, hailed Ainsley to ask the estate's price on the autumn clip, and the two men fell to French. Beatrice had her French from books. She knew good French when she heard it, and the French that came out of the plain brown coat was not a clerk's schoolroom French. It was a nobleman's French, easy and idle and bred in the bone, the French of a man who had learned it from a French valet and a French tutor and long soft years of it, and had never once had to think about the case of a noun. The merchant drove on. Ainsley said something light. Beatrice walked beside him and did her sums. A ruined gentleman, she was sure of it now, better than sure. A man of real family, real blood, come down so far and so hard that he hid over a stable and answered to a plain name and mended roofs with his own soft hands. The bow, the French, the ring, the grammar, the way the great house's servants deferred to him past all reason for a mere agent. He was hiding a shame. He was a fallen man clinging to his last pride, which was that no one should know how far he'd fallen. And she loved him. There, she let herself think the word at last, walking home in the dusk. She loved him, and loving him, she saw with a terrible clearness what she must never do. She must never, whatever her heart did, let this good ruined man near her ruin. He had lost everything once already. She would not be the second fall of him. A man rebuilding himself from 40 shillings did not need a wife who came with £620 of another man's failure and a bank agent circling like a crow. She resolved it on that walk, before he'd asked her anything at all. Whatever he felt, and she thought now that he felt something, she would not let him spend it on her. She would love him at the stile in the afternoons, and she would let him go whole. She did not know she was resolving to break her own heart, to save a duke from a debt he could buy with the loose coin in his study. Up at the great house, another kind of love was being rehearsed. Lady Cassandra Vaunt believed the Duke of Kelmscar to be abroad, Italy, someone had said. Or was it Vienna? And she had decided, with the cool method she brought to all her campaigns, that he should return to find himself already half won. She could not court a man who wasn't there. But she could prepare the ground, so she took up her pen. Her maid, brushing out her hair of an evening, was made to sit and listen while her mistress tried her phrases aloud. "Your Grace, I confess your absence has taught me the measure of my own heart." Cassandra frowned at the glass. "No, too forward. Your Grace, the quiet of the county turns all my thoughts toward—" She tapped the pen against her teeth. "Toward what sounds least like money, Mary. What sounds least like money?" "I'm sure I don't know, my lady," said the maid, who knew exactly, and knew better than to say. Cassandra wrote, and struck out, and wrote again, composing tenderness the way a merchant composes an invoice. She had never met the man. She did not know the colour of his eyes. She knew the acreage of Kelmscar to the field, and the rent roll to the pound, and she knew that a coronet, once on a head, does not come off. That was love enough, in her book. That was the whole of love, properly understood. You know a thing she does not. You know the coronet she's writing to is mending a vestry roof 3 miles off, in a stable coat, and has never once thought of her. Hold the 2 women in your mind together, the one composing love to a title she's never met, the one at the stile resolving to give up the man himself to spare him her debt. Both of them in love, they'd each have said. Only one of them was. The bank did not wait. Silas Croom came again, and this time he came to Beatrice, having taken her father's measure and found him no obstacle. He caught her on the Ludlow road in his gig, and made her stand and hear him, and what he offered was the cruellest kindness she had ever been shown. "I'll speak plain, Miss Alden, for I think you're a plain-dealing woman under all your Greek." He looked down at her from the gig. £620. Your father cannot pay it, not in 90 days, not in 900. When the note falls due, the glebe is mine, and the vicarage with it, and you and the old man will be on the parish. Or worse. That's the shape of it. You know it's the shape of it. She said nothing. She did know. Now he softened, which was worse. "I'm a widower. I've a good house in Ludlow and a name at the bank. Marry me, and the bond goes on the fire the same day. Torn up. Your father keeps his living, your little school keeps its benches, and you keep a roof, a better roof than that leaking barn you teach in. One word from you, and it's all undone." He smiled. "I'm not a hard man, whatever they say. I only want what's mine, and I find I could want you at that price." It was a way out. It was the only way out that existed in the whole of the world, and it was laid at her feet by a man who had shamed her in a candlelit hall and would foreclose on children. "No," Beatrice said. Just the one word. She saw it surprise him. He had thought the sum would do his courting for him. "Consider it," he said, the softness curdling. "You'll not get another offer, Miss Alden. Not you. Consider what your no costs the old man. 90 days. And he shook the reins and left her in the road. She walked home shaking, but not with doubt. She would not sell herself to save the school, because a school bought that way was not worth the keeping, and a father shielded that way would die of the shame of it. She had said no, and she would go on saying no, and the clock would run out, and she would lose everything, and even then she found she would not have paid Silas Croom's price. She thought that was the hardest no she would ever have to say. She was wrong. The hardest was 8 days off, and she would say it to the one man she wanted to say yes to, and it would cost her more than Croom ever could. The benches were marked that week. Croom sent a man round with chalk and a ledger, and the fellow went through the vestry counting the school's poor furniture, and he set a small white cross on each bench, where it would be seized and sold when the note fell due. Beatrice watched him do it. 12 crosses, on 12 benches, where 12 boys sat each morning learning to read the world. She did not stop him. There was no stopping him. When he'd gone, she stood in the empty cold room among the marked benches and let herself, for one moment only, feel the whole weight of it, and then she put it down again, because there were accounts to keep and a class in the morning and no time in her life for despair. That was where Thomas Ainsley found her. In the marked room, in the last light, alone, he stood in the doorway a while before she knew he was there. When she turned and saw his face, she knew something in it had changed. Some long argument in him had ended. He came in and looked at the little white crosses on the benches, one after another, and she watched a muscle move in his jaw. "They mean to take even these," he said. "A debt is a debt." She heard the flatness in her own voice. "So I'm told." He crossed the room to her, close in the failing light, among the marked benches, and she saw in the way he stood that he had come to say something he'd carried a long way, and her heart turned over, because she thought she knew what it was, and she had already decided how she must answer. "Beatrice," he had never used her name before. "I have nothing. You know what I am, 40 shillings a month and a room over the horses. I've no house to bring you to, and no fortune to mend any of this, and God knows I've turned it every way to find one, and there's none. He drew something from his coat. "But I have this. It's all a man like me can buy. And I would rather offer you this, and be honest, than offer you nothing, and be safe." It was a ring, a plain silver band, thin, worth perhaps a few shillings, the kind a working man saves for. He held it out to her on his soft, wrong-beloved palm. "Marry me," he said. "Not for the school, not for any of it. I can't save the school, I can't save the glebe, I can't save you a penny of what's coming. Marry me for nothing but that I love you, and I think, I have hoped, you might love me. Poor as we'd both be, marry the man Beatrice and let the rest go." And there it was. The one thing she wanted in the whole cold world, held out to her on the hand she'd loved before she'd let herself love the rest of him. To say yes was to have him. To say yes was to be, for once, chosen, plainly, poorly, for herself and nothing else. She looked at the little silver ring, and she looked at his hands, and she said no. "I can't." Her voice did not shake. She would not let it shake. "Thomas, no, I won't." "Beatrice, listen to me." She stepped back from the ring, because if she stayed near it, she would take it. "You've fallen once already. I know you have, no don't. I've always known. I read it in your hands the first day. You're a gentleman brought low, and you've clawed your way to 40 shillings and a name of your own, and it's honest, and it's yours. And you would throw it into a pit for me. £620, Thomas. A bank that wants the ground I stand on. My father's ruin and my father's shame, and a school they're going to sell out from under 12 children. That is my dowry. That is everything I'd bring you, and I will not do it. I will not hand my debts to a good man's hands." Her voice broke once, and she mastered it. "I love you too well to marry you. That's the whole of it. I love you too well." He stood there with the ring on his open palm, and she watched him understand that she meant it, that this was not a woman to be argued round, that her no came not from doubt of him, but from the very depth of her caring, which was worse, which was unanswerable. She had just told him she loved him, and in the same breath she had refused him, to spare him. There was no test he could set that she had not, in that moment, blindingly passed. She loved the man. She had every reason under heaven to grasp at him, and she had let him go instead, to save him. And he had no way left to win her that did not begin with a lie he'd told at the very start. His hand closed round the silver ring, slowly, knuckles white, the way they'd gone in the candle-lit hall. "Then that's your answer," he said, low. "That's my answer. Forgive me. Please, go, and don't fall for me. Rise, you're worth a great deal more than this parish and its debts, and one day someone will love you who costs you nothing, and you'll thank me." She was lying, in her way, as gravely as he had ever lied to her, for she did not want him to rise and go and be loved by someone else. She wanted to die a little where she stood. But she said it, and she meant him to believe it. "Good night, Thomas." He looked at her a long moment in the last grey light. Among the marked benches, the silver ring shut in his fist. Then he turned and walked out of the vestry into the dark of the lane, and she let him go. She stood alone in the cold room and did not weep, because she had trained herself out of it and found for the first time in years that the training failed her, and that she wept anyway, silently, one hand pressed to the marked wood of a bench that would not be hers past 90 days. She thought she had just saved him. Out in the black lane, the man she called Thomas Ainsley walked back toward the great house he owned, with a 5-shilling silver ring crushed into his palm and a coronet ring locked in a study 3 miles ahead, undone, wrecked, wild, with a thing that was half heartbreak and half a terrible soaring joy. Because she loved him. She had proven it past any doubt a man could raise. And in proving it she had refused him, and slammed shut the honest door, and left him only the one road he had sworn he would never take, to become the Duke again in front of her, and lay the whole lie bare, and pray she could forgive the man who had let her stand shamed in his own hall, and grieve a clerk who never was. He stopped in the dark of the lane. He opened his hand and looked at the little ring by starlight. And then, slow and cold, another thought came to him. If she would not take his hand while the debt stood between them, then the debt would have to fall. Not by her knowing. Never by her knowing, or she'd refuse that too. £620 was nothing to Adrian Voss, Duke of Kelmscar. It was a line in a ledger. He could buy the bond out of Croom's own bank tomorrow in the estate's name and burn it, and she need never know who'd done it. He put the silver ring in his breast pocket over his heart and turned again for home with his mind made up. He was about to do a great kindness in the most dangerous possible way. And in the study 3 miles off, the coronet ring waited in the dark. And Silas Croom, who did not yet know his best bond was about to be bought over his head by the very clerk he'd never troubled to notice, slept the sound sleep of a man who thinks he has already won. The morning after came grey and honest, the way mornings do when a heart has spent itself in the dark. Beatrice woke to the sound of her father coughing over his shaving basin. She lay still a moment. Then she rose, and put on the mended grey glove, and went down to a house that owed £620, and did not know she knew it. She would not think of the clerk. That was the rule she made for herself over the porridge. She had done a kind thing. She had spared a poor man a burden that was not his to carry. If it had cost her the one face she wanted to see across a table for the rest of her life, well, kindness was supposed to cost something, or it was only appetite in a Sunday coat. She told herself this. She did not believe it. She went to the vestry all the same. 3 miles off, in a study she had never seen, the man she grieved was not grieving. He was working. Fenwick found him at the great desk before the fire was properly caught, a pen already moving, the coronet ring turned round and round on his little finger the way it did when his mind ran hard. The old steward stood in the doorway a while and said nothing. He had known this boy since the boy was in leading strings. He had watched him bury a father, refuse 100 painted heiresses, and come at last to Shropshire in a stable coat like a man walking into the sea to see if it would hold him. Pennock had thought it folly then. He was less sure now. "She refused you," Pennock said. "She did." The Duke did not look up. "And do you know, Pennock, it is the finest thing that has ever happened to me. You look like a man who's been dragged behind a cart." "I feel like one." The pen stopped. He looked up, and his eyes were bright and terrible. She would not take my hand because she would not hand me her father's ruin. That was her whole reason. She stood in that vestry and gave up the thing she wanted to keep me from a debt. "Pennock, do you understand what I have found?" "I understand you've found a way to make yourself miserable that most men never think of." The Duke laughed. It cracked in the middle. Then he pushed the paper across the desk. "Go to Croom's bank, not as yourself, in the estate's name. I want the mill bond, the whole £620, the note the vicar co-signed. Buy it out. Pay whatever the little man asks, and do not haggle. I want it in my hand by the week's end." Pennock read the paper. His face did a slow, careful thing. "And she's not to know." "She's never to know. If she knew it was mine, she'd refuse that too. You saw it. She'd sooner drown than be rescued by a man she thinks can't swim." He turned the coronet ring again. "So I'll rescue her from the shore, where she can't see who threw the rope. The debt falls. The school stands. Her father keeps his glebe, and she goes on thinking a poor clerk loved her and lost her, and never knows the clerk had gold enough to drown Shropshire in." Pennock folded the paper into his coat. At the door he stopped. "And when she learns it?" "Because they always learn it, sir. Secrets this size have legs." "Then I'll be there when she does," the Duke said, "and I'll take whatever she gives me for lying to her." But she'll be safe first. That's the order of it. Safe first." The old man went out, and the master of 40 servants sat alone in his own study, in a stable coat he need never have worn, and looked at a 5-shilling silver ring that lay on the desk beside a coronet worth a county, and could not for the life of him have said which one he'd rather she took. So the deed was done, quiet as a thief. Pennock rode to Harndean. He sat across a green baize table from Silas Croom and named a figure, and Croom, who wanted gleebeakers, not gold, but who was a banker before he was a speculator, could not in the end refuse hard coin laid down for a bond gone stale. He took the money. He signed the note over to the estate. He did it with a sour mouth, because a paid debt is a smaller thing than a foreclosed vicarage. And he had wanted the vicarage. He had wanted the whole plump living of it, the glebe and the school and the pride of the woman who had refused him. Now here came a fat estate agent's clerk, buying it all out from under him with somebody else's purse. Croom signed. But he did not forget, and a thwarted man is a dangerous animal, because he has nothing left to lose but his temper. Beatrice knew none of this. She knew only that the days went strange, that the letter never came from the bank that she had braced for, that her father, who had gone about grey and folded for a month, came in one evening from the low road, with a look on him she had not seen in 3 winters, a loosening, a lightness, like a man who has set down a sack he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was heavy. "Papa," she said, "what is it?" "Nothing, child." He would not meet her eye. But he smiled at the fire. A mercy I don't understand and won't question. She let it go. She had her own weight to carry, and it had a plain face and hands that were wrong for a clerk. Because she had not stopped seeing him, of course. That was the cruelty of a small village. She saw him at a distance, mending a gate on the estate's low farm, walking the field paths with a ledger, tipping his hat to her across the churchyard with a face that had gone shut and formal since the night she'd refused him. He kept his word. He did not press her. He did not come to the vestry with tithe papers he did not need. He gave her exactly the distance she had asked for, and every inch of it was a small daily amputation. She began to suspect the truth of him then, not the whole truth, but pieces. There was the day the wool merchant came through, a travelled man with a fat purse and a fatter opinion of himself, and fell into talk with Ainsley over a pen of ewes. Beatrice was near enough to hear, and the merchant, showing off, dropped into French, the fast river French of a man who has done business in Lyons. And Ainsley answered him, not the halting French of a clerk who'd conned a phrase-book, the other kind, the kind that lives in the mouth from the cradle, the French of nurseries and tutors and long cold rooms in great houses. It came out of him easy as water, and then his eyes cut sideways and found her listening, and the river French shut off like a tap, and he said something flat and English about the price of the ewes. Beatrice went home and sat a long while with a Latin line unfinished on her slate. A fallen gentleman, she thought. That was the shape of it. A man born high and brought low, a ruined name, a squandered fortune, some old shame that had driven him to 40 shillings a month and a lodging over a stable. It explained the hands that had never held a plough. It explained the French. It explained the pale band on his finger where a signet had been. And his quick, cheap story about pawning it in a bad year. A pawned signet ring. Of course. He had been somebody once. He was hiding it. And God help her, it did not cool her love. It fed it. Because now she understood him. Now she thought she knew the whole grief of the man, proud born, proud fallen, too honourable to trade on a name he'd disgraced, courting a vicar's plain daughter because she was the one creature in Shropshire who might love the ruin and not mourn the fortune. She thought she had read him to the bone. She had read the wrong book with great attention. But she had read it with her whole heart, and that, in the end, was the only thing that mattered. At the great house, meanwhile, another woman was writing another kind of letter. Lady Cassandra Vaunt did not love the Duke of Kelmscar. She had never met the Duke of Kelmscar. She had seen him once at a distance, 3 seasons back, across a ballroom she had priced to the shilling. But she loved his house. She loved his acres and his 40 servants, and the coronet that would sit so well on her own fair head. And she had heard the country whisper that the elusive Duke had come down at last to his neglected Shropshire seat, was in residence, they said, though he kept himself close and would see no one. So she took rooms nearby, and she laid her siege by post. Her maid Mary watched her do it, evening after evening, and remembered it all, because maids remember everything, and are the last people the clever ever think to fear. "Read it back to me, Mary," Lady Cassandra would say, holding the candle to the wet ink. "The part about his solitude. I've called it noble, haven't I? Men like to be told their sulking is noble." And Mary would read it back, a tender, aching thing, all longing for a man Cassandra would not have crossed a puddle to save from drowning if he'd been poor. Longing rehearsed. Grief performed to a mirror. She wrote of his eyes, whose colour she did not know. She wrote of the loneliness of great men, and her own soul's kinship with it, and she wrote it the way a grocer weighs sugar, with one eye always on the scale. "He'll not answer these at first," she told Mary, sealing another. "The clever ones never do. But he'll keep them. And when I meet him, at his own harvest assembly, where he can't hide, he'll have a stack of my sweetness in his desk, and a face to put to it. That's how it's done, girl. You don't win a coronet by wanting it. You win it by seeming not to." Somewhere 3 miles off, a plain vicar's daughter was mending a grey glove for the 4th time and refusing a poor clerk to spare him her father's debt. The 2 women never met. But the story had set them side by side, on purpose, the way a jeweller lays paste beside a true stone so the eye can learn the difference. The harvest assembly was set for the turn of the season. In the great hall of the house, the same lantern-lit hall, under the same high dark rafters, where Beatrice had been cut and shamed at Michaelmas by the county set and by Croom's careless tongue. The whole village would come, and the gentry with them. It was the one night the 2 Fenwick Crosses stood in the same room, and it was there that Silas Croom decided to have his revenge. He could not foreclose. The bond was paid, bought out from under him, and it galled him worse than any loss of money, the sense of a hand he could not see, moving pieces he'd thought were his. But if he could not take the vicarage, he could take the woman's name. He was that kind of small. He put it about, in the week before the assembly, in the low, sly way such things travel. That Beatrice Alden was no better than she should be, that the vicar's bluestocking had thrown herself at a moneyless stable clerk, having failed to catch anything better, that a debtor's daughter who angled after a 40-shilling agent was a schemer reaching above her station, and would be shown up for it, publicly, if the village had eyes. And Lady Cassandra, arriving to lay her final siege, met Croom at the edge of his malice and found it convenient. She did not know Beatrice. She had merely heard, now, that some parish nobody had been seen walking the field paths with a common agent of the estate that was to be hers. It offended her sense of arrangement. 2 thwarted people then, briefly of one mind. Croom would expose the debtor's daughter. Cassandra would enjoy it. The assembly would be the stage. Word of the whispers reached Beatrice the way such things always reach their subject last and cruelest. She heard it from a child, in the vestry, one of her own ploughboys, repeating what his mother had said over the wash, not understanding a word of it. That Miss Alden was to be shown up at the great house, that she'd chased a poor man and got above herself, and the fine folk were going to make sport of her for it. Beatrice sat very still on the school bench, one of the 12 benches that Croom's man had marked with chalk crosses for seizure, back when there was still a debt to seize for. The chalk was long since wiped, though she did not know why. She sat there and felt the old cold shame come up her spine, the Michaelmas shame doubled now. She made up her mind that afternoon she would leave Fenwick Cross. quietly, before the assembly, before her father could be splashed with her disgrace. She would take a governor's place in some far county where no one had heard of a debtor's daughter and a stable clerk. She would spare her father. It was the same reasoning that had made her refuse the silver ring, "I would not hand my ruin to a good man," turned now upon herself. She was very good at deciding to be the one who was spared from. She went to the vestry that evening to gather the few books that were truly hers, and on the stone sill of the window, where the last light came in low and gold, she found the plain silver ring. He had left it there. She never learned when. It sat on the cold stone, a small 5-shilling circle, and it undid her more thoroughly than any letter could have. She picked it up. She held it in the mended grey glove, and she understood that he had given her back the thing she'd refused, not in reproach, she thought, but because a fallen gentleman with nothing had nothing else to leave, and had left it where she'd know his hand. She put it in her pocket, over her own heart, the way, though she did not know it, he had once carried it over his, and she resolved to go to the assembly after all. Once, to stand in that hall one last time with her chin up, and let them do their worst, and then go. She would not sneak away like a guilty thing. She had done nothing but love a poor man. Let the county make what sport of that it dared. She did not know the poor man would be in the room. The night of the harvest assembly, the great hall of Kelmscar blazed, every lantern lit, the long tables down the middle heaped with the season's plenty, the rafters lost in warm dark far overhead. The whole village crowded the low end, the ploughboys scrubbed pink, the dairymaids in their good aprons, farmers stiff in Sunday black. The gentry held the high end, silks and candle shine, Lady Cassandra among them in ice blue, her fan working, her eyes bright with the evening's promised sport. Beatrice came in plain grey. She stood near the low tables with the village she taught, and she kept her chin level, and she waited. Silas Croom did not make her wait long. He liked an audience, and here was the whole county for one. He rose from the high table with a glass in his hand and a smile like a split in old wood, and he tapped the glass for quiet, and he got it. "Friends," he said. "Neighbours, before we eat the Duke's good bread, and where is our elusive host tonight, I wonder, let me say a plain word about plain dealing." His eye found Beatrice down the hall and held her there like a pin through a moth. There are some among us tonight who make a great show of virtue, a vicarage, a little school, Latin, if you please, taught to ploughboys by a lady too fine for the marriage market. And yet, he let it hang. And yet the same lady has been seen walking out, unchaperoned, with a common agent of this very estate. A man of 40 shillings a month, a debtor's daughter, angling after a stable clerk, having caught nothing better. I only ask, friends, is that the virtue we're to swallow with that's enough. The voice came from the low end of the hall, from among the village, and it was quiet, and it stopped Croom's mouth as cleanly as a hand across it. Thomas Ainsley stepped out from the crowd of farmers in his plain clerk's coat. Beatrice's heart turned right over. He was not supposed to be here. A 40-shilling agent did not stand among the gentry at the master's own assembly. He should have been below the salt with the servants if he was here at all. And yet here he came, walking up the centre of the hall between the long tables, unhurried, his worn coat catching the lantern light, straight towards Silas Croom. "You'll not finish that sentence, Mr. Croom," he said. "Not about her. Not in this house." Croom's split-wood smile came back. "Mina, and who are you, sirrah, to tell me what I'll finish?" "A clerk, a hired man." "Step back to your better's table before I have you put out into the Pennock." Ainsley did not raise his voice. He only said the old man's name. And from the shadow behind the high table, the steward came forward into the light. He was carrying something, a flat leather case and a heavy thing wrapped in cloth, and he set them on the long table before all of them and unwrapped the heavy thing, and it was the estate seal, the great silver seal of Kelmscar that every man in that hall had seen pressed into the wax of his own lease, or his own tithe, or his own hiring paper. Pennock lifted it so the county could see. And then the old steward spoke, and his voice was the voice of a man who has waited 40 years to say a thing, and means to say it well. My lords, ladies, and good people of Fenwick Cross. He set his hand on the plain-coated man's shoulder. This is not a clerk. This is not an agent. This is Adrian Voss, the 7th Duke of Kelmscar. Your landlord, the master of this house and every acre you stand on. He has kept these 3 months among you as Thomas Ainsley, 40 shillings a month, by his own choosing and my own certain knowledge, and I'll stake my 40 years' service and my soul on the truth of it. The hall did not gasp. It went silent. That worse thing. A silence you could have heard a lantern gutter in. Then, slowly, unevenly, like a field of corn going over in a wind, the county gentry began to rise from the high table, and to bow. Lady Cassandra half rose with them before she knew what she did, her fan gone still, bowing, before she caught herself, to the man she had crossed a county to court, whom she had been picturing in some far room, whom she had never once suspected walked the field paths in a stable coat under her very nose. She had written him tender letters about the loneliness of great men, and the great man had been the shabby agent she'd have swept her skirts aside from in a lane. The whole shining top of the room bent itself double to a man in a 40-shilling coat, and Silas Croom's glass shook in his hand, because Silas Croom had just remembered, in the pit of his stomach, exactly whom he had sold a certain bond to a fortnight since. Not the estate. The man. This man. But the Duke was not looking at any of them. He had turned, in all that silence, to the plain grey figure at the low end of the hall. And he was looking at Beatrice. "Now, Mr. Croom," he said, still quiet, without turning back. "You were speaking of debts." He held out his hand, and Pennock laid the flat leather case in it, and the Duke opened it on the long table where every eye could fall. He drew out a single folded paper, old, creased, a red seal broken across it. "The mill bond," he said, £620. Co-signed by the Reverend Josiah Alden a great many years ago for a woolen mill that died. Called in by Harndean and Croom this autumn, with 90 days to pay, or the bank would take the gleebakers and foreclose the vicarage and turn a free school of 12 benches out into the lane. He lifted his eyes to Croom. "That was your intention, was it not? The land, cheap, the living, stripped, and when the vicar could not pay, you offered his daughter a way to buy it back." His voice did not rise. Somehow that was worse. "You offered to tear up her father's ruin if she would marry you, and she refused you. And so you thought tonight to take her name, since you could not take her land." He held the bond up, and then, without any flourish at all, in the plainest gesture in the world, he tore it across, and across again, and let the pieces fall onto the table among the harvest plenty. "It was bought a fortnight since," he said, "in this estate's name, paid in full, out of my own purse, to your own bank, over your own counter, Mr. Croom, though you'd have thought it went to some fat agent, and never to the clerk you couldn't trouble yourself to notice. The debt is gone, the glebe is safe, the vicarage stands, and the 12 benches of the Free School of Fenwick Cross." He looked down the hall now, at the ploughboys, at the dairymaids, at the plain grey woman among them, "are struck off every ledger in the county. Tonight, before all of you, forever, the Reverend Josiah Alden, at the low table, had put both his old hands over his face, and his shoulders were shaking, and no one thought the worse of him for it. But it was to Beatrice the Duke spoke now. He came down the hall to her, past the bowing gentry, past the ruined banker, past the woman in ice blue, and he stopped in front of the woman in mended grey. And the whole county strained to hear a thing he said almost too low to carry. There was a test, he said. Only ever the one. 3 seasons in London I was weighed like plate. Every heiress in England could tell you to the shilling what my name was worth, and not one of them could have told you the colour of my eyes. So I came here as nothing. 40 shillings a month, and no name worth marrying, to find out if there was one woman alive who could love the man and never miss the coronet. His voice caught, and he let it. And when you had every reason on earth to walk away, when I stood before you a penniless clerk and your family owed £600, you refused me, to spare me your ruin. You gave up the thing you wanted to keep a poor man free of your debt. He said it so the room would hear this part at least. That is the only test that was ever set in this county. And she passed it before any of you when she thought there was nothing to be gained and everything to lose. Remember that the next time you cut a plain woman in a mended glove. Silas Croom tried to leave with dignity and was not permitted even that. 2 of the directors of the Harndean and Croom Bank were in the hall that night, guests at the high table, in their good coats, and they had heard every word. They had heard how their own agent had called in a vicar's bond to strip a parish cheap, and had sold that same bond unknowing to the bank's single greatest client, the Duke of Kelmscar himself, whose accounts were the making of the firm. They rose from the high table, the both of them, grey-faced, and they did not bow to Croom. One of them spoke a short, cold sentence to him across the silence, that his name would be off the door of the bank by Lady Day and his standing revoked, and that he need not present himself at Harndean again. And Silas Croom, who had wanted the glebe and the vicarage and the pride of the woman who'd refused him, went out through the whole crowded hall, through the very village he had schemed to turn into the lane, with his glass still in his hand and no one moving to make him a path. They simply let him find his own way through, past every face he had wronged, and out the far door into the dark. No one fell but by his own words. Lady Cassandra Vaunt fell by hers. She had drawn back toward the tall windows, hoping, perhaps to be forgotten in the general astonishment, to slip out unremarked and leave the county to its gossip. But her maid Mary was in the hall, among the servants and the county set, cruel and bored and delighted, had already begun to remember aloud that Lady Cassandra had taken rooms nearby and written to a duke she thought was hiding, a duke who it now appeared had been mending gates in a stable coat the whole while. "Why, Mary," said some laughing lady of the high set, turning on the poor girl for sport, "your mistress has such a gift for a love letter, they say. Have you not one of her sweeter ones by heart?" And Mary, who remembered everything, and who had been made to read those letters back 100 times over a candle, and who owed her mistress no particular kindness, Mary, in the awful obliging way of a frightened servant, recited one. Just a little of it. The tender aching part about the noble solitude of great men, and the loneliness of the coronet, and the kinship of her own poor soul. Every word of it composed to a mirror, weighed like sugar, meant for a fortune and a name and a house. Recited now, flat, in a scared girl's voice, to the very man it had been written to seduce, who had walked past its author for 3 months in a coat she'd have spat on. The county did not roar. It laughed, softly, which is the worst laughter there is, and Lady Cassandra Vaunt, who had performed her virtue for an audience that was never the one that counted, gathered her ice-blue skirts and withdrew from the hall to the sound of it, with nothing left to court and nothing left to sell. And then the hall emptied, in its own time, the village going home down the black lanes, full of a story they'd tell for 40 years, the gentry to their carriages, the servants to bank the fires, until at last there was only the great hearth burning down, and a plain grey woman and a man in a worn coat, standing in the wreck of the Harvest Plenty, with a torn bond scattered on the table between them. He took the silver ring from his breast pocket. She had it too, of course, in her own, the one from the vestry sill, but he had another. There had always been the 2 rings. He had told her once he'd pawned his signet in a bad year, and she had believed him, and built a whole fallen gentleman out of the lie. Now he opened his hand by the firelight, and there lay the 5-shilling silver ring, the one a 40-shilling clerk could afford, the only ring Thomas Ainsley had ever owned. This was the man's, he said, the one you refused, the one you loved when he was nothing. He held it out. Take that one first. It matters to me that you take that one first. Beatrice looked at it a long moment. Then she drew off the mended grey glove, and she let him put the plain silver ring on her hand, and she said, in a voice not quite steady, "I never wanted the other." "I know," he said. "That's the whole of why I'm asking." And only then, when the silver was on her finger, did he reach into his coat again and bring out the second ring, the heavy old coronet ring of Kelmscar, gold and worn smooth by 7 dukes, that had waited all this while locked in a study 3 miles off. He held it up beside the silver one in the firelight, the two of them together in his palm. "And this is the man's too," he said. "They were always the same hands, Beatrice, the hands you said were wrong for a clerk. You were right about them. You were right the whole time and loved me anyway." His voice went low and rough. The man in the coat and the man with the coronet were never 2 men. They were only ever the pair of hands you chose. "Will you have them both?" She was crying now. At last the tears she had refused to cry at Michaelmas, and refused all through the shame. She put her bare hand into his 2 hands, over the silver ring and the gold, and that was her answer, and he did not need any other. Outside, the last of the village went home under the harvest stars, carrying the tale. Inside, by a dying fire, a duke who had made himself a clerk to be truly chosen was, at long last, truly chosen. A year turned round. It was spring again at Fenwick Cross, and the reading school was rebuilt in good grey stone, with a slate roof that no borrowed ladder would ever have to mend again, and Beatrice's own name cut over the door for anyone to read who could, and a great many more could now than a year before. Inside, on new benches with never a chalk cross among them, 12 ploughboys and 3 dairymaids stumbled through their Greek in the morning light, and got it wrong, and got it right, and were corrected by a woman who wore a plain silver ring on her right hand. On her left hand she wore the coronet ring of Kelmscar. The Reverend Josiah Alden was hale that spring, and preached with his old fire, a man who had set down a sack he'd carried 3 winters, and would not pick up another. He had walked his daughter to her wedding in the little church with his back straight, and if he still could not quite say aloud how the debt had come to fall, he had stopped being too proud to be glad of it. There was a note came through the county, now and again, small news, the way it does, that the bank at Harndean, which Silas Croom had served so long and so ill, had a new agent behind its counter, and served a different master these days, and had grown very careful indeed about the bonds it chose to call in. Croom himself had gone off nobody quite knew where, to somewhere a man's name was not yet known. It is a large country. There is always somewhere. And Lady Cassandra Vaunt, they said, was still writing her tender letters, still composing to a mirror the loneliness of great men and the kinship of her own soul. Only now there was no duke left in England who did not know the whole story, and so her sweetness went out by every post and came back by none, and she wrote on to no one who would ever trouble to answer. But at Fenwick Cross the fire was warm, and the Greek was recited, and a woman who had once patched the same grey glove for 3 winters and never looked up when a stranger tipped his hat, now looked up gladly every evening when a certain pair of hands came in at her door. She had known those hands were wrong for a clerk. She had loved them anyway, when there was nothing in the world to be gained by it and a family's ruin to be risked. That, in the end, was the only coronet that ever counted, not the one given by 7 dead dukes, but the one a plain man in a plain coat is handed freely across a vestry by a woman who wants the hands and never wants the gold. A title can be given, only a man can be chosen. She chose the man. Tell me, would you have known his hands? Comment the town you're watching from, and let me know.